Good afternoon, everybody. We'll have you take your seats. We'll try to get started and keep things moving on time here. Thank you for joining us this afternoon in the auditorium of the Harrison Institute and Small Special Collections Library of the University of Virginia. My name is Joel Kowarski. I'm the moderator. That's all you'll hear about me. Special thanks are owed to the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and the Virginia Festival of the Book for their ongoing support for this annual event. Couple of general points. Please fill out those evaluation forms you get and return them to the volunteers at the end of this session. They're very important for the festival. They help guide all the decisions for future programs. They're not just invaluable in terms of critiquing what goes on in here. Most of the festival sessions are free to the public, but not free to produce. So please consider a donation either via the online site or pick up a giving envelope at the Omni Hotel. Also, in terms of supporting the authors and the supporting bookstores, please consider purchasing a book. You will have the ability to do that over there after the talks. They will be signing books up here, so it'll come this way at the end of both speakers. Please either turn off your cell phones or mute them. I have to remind myself this as well. I've been known to not remember to do that. If you wish to tweet about this event, this is novel for me. Apparently, you can use hashtag capital V, like in Victor, -A, book space 2015.
No dash. No dash.
Huh?
No dash.
No dash?
That's for you to read phonetically.
That's for me to read phonetically.
That's right.
Got it. See, that tells you I know none of this. Okay. It's a good thing my phone's off. I'd have caused all kinds of trouble, but I'm not on Twitter anyway, so that's not really an issue. We have two speakers with us for this session. It looks like one of them is more technically adept than I am. And we'll hear first for Dr. Seymour Schwartz on his recent biography of the underappreciated 18th century polymath, American polymath, Cadwallader Colden. Our second speaker is Mr. Marc Leepson, who will discuss his recent biography of Francis Scott Key, the Maryland attorney and amateur poet who wrote the words for our Star-Spangled Banner during the War of 1812. Please hold any questions until the end of both talks. There will be time for that and also time for you to buy and have your book signed. The signing will occur up here toward the front. Some of you may have seen that Special Collections has kindly put out several representative maps and letters around the time that both of these talks will represent. And one last reminder about the questions. Keep those questions short. This gives people a chance to participate in the discussion. The first speaker today, Seymour Schwartz, you've got a minute, Si. Okay, I got to tell them about you first. You heard enough of that? Has spoken at this book festival on several past occasions. He has bequeathed the bulk of his collection on the early mapping of North America to Special Collections here. He is a distinguished alumni professor of surgery at the University of Rochester in New York. He's authored over 200 medical articles, several surgical textbooks, and has been president of several major national surgical societies. He's written a number of well-regarded books pertaining to the mapping of North America, specifically including the title The Mapping of North America that he co-authored with Ralph Ehrenberg from the Library of Congress, and this is one of the major references on the subject. Dr. Schwartz has served on the boards of the National Museum of American History of the Smithsonian Institution and the Philip Lee Phillips Society of the Geography and Map Division of the Library of Congress. Our second speaker, Mr. Marc Leepson, is a journalist and public historian and the author of 8 books. Is that 9 now?
It will be next year.
It will be next year, okay. His most recent, and I understand it really is not really your most recent, what so proudly Reed-hailed is the subject of today's talk. Mr. Leepson has also had a long career as a freelance writer for such well-respected publications as the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and a columnist for a newspaper published by the Vietnam Veterans of America. Although he is from New Jersey, he has been a long-time Virginia resident and is a graduate of George Washington University. He is also a contributor to the Virginia Dictionary of Biography and the Oxford Encyclopedia of American Political and Legal History. He's been interviewed on numerous well-known television shows. So again, thank you for coming. Remember that books are available for sale and signing. Fill out those evaluation forms at the end, and I will now welcome our first speaker, Dr. Seymour Schwartz.
Thank you very much, Joel. The book I'm going to talk about had an extraordinary gestational period of 40 years, truly so, and it began with a map. As is indicated, I'm a map collector. I saw this map, and I found out this map, 1724, was drawn by a chap named Cadwallader Colden. So I tried to learn something about him and learned very rapidly that he was the subject of an extraordinary amount of literature, shown here, 9 volumes published by the New York Historical Society, 4,000 words, but had never had a biography written about him. There was only one printed item that could be obtained telling about him, and that was a self-published book by a candidate for a PhD degree in political science at Columbia University in 1906, a woman by the name of Miss Keyes, Dr. Keyes, self-published, no biography on the gentleman. So over the ensuing 35 years, I made several abortive attempts, if you will, to learn about him, and then about 2 or 3 years ago decided to concentrate on him. And what I found out in this period of concentration, that it brings into focus an extraordinary man whom I don't like. A man who served the colony of New York for over a half century, longer than any other human being. His name also identifies a physician, a scientist, a botanist, an ethnographer, a philosopher, and a savant, who is deemed by Benjamin Franklin and others as, quote, the most knowledgeable man in all of the colonies. But if I were to encapsulate in just 3 words his life, it would be 3 adjectives: famed, flawed, and forgotten. What better title, what better person to try to write a biography about? Here is the gentleman who is the subject of the biography. Born in 1688 to a minister in Scotland, educated at Edinburgh Medical School, University, and then went on for 5 years to study to be a physician and set up a practice there, which became immediately unsuccessful. And as a consequence of his lack of success, he accepted an invitation from his mother's widowed and childless sister to join her in Philadelphia, where he then could set up a practice and help his aunt in her mercantile trade with the West Indies. So in 1715, he arrived in Philadelphia. 1711, he arrived in Philadelphia, worked there for 4 years, went back for a short visit to Scotland to find himself a wife and a Christie, and then returned to America in 1715, never to leave again. At that time, you want to know that there were only 11 physicians in all of the colonies who had valid degrees, either from Great Britain or from Europe. And he developed a correspondence with many of them. And the first thing he did was to attempt to set up the first medical teaching issue in the United States in Philadelphia. He was going to teach a course, postgraduate course, in medicine to the Philadelphians, and sought money from the assembly in Philadelphia, particularly John Logan, and they refused him. So he then developed an unsuccessful practice in Philadelphia, and his next move was to go pay a visit to the governor of New York, who was a fellow Scot, and he received them quite well. The governor then immediately invited this educated man to come to the colony of New York as the Surveyor General, and he accepted the invitation. So from 1718 on, Colden is a New Yorker and will be a New Yorker for the rest of his life, serving the colony of New York for a longer period of time than anybody in history. When he arrived in New York, pro forma, the way they did it then for government officials, was to allocate land. He was given 2,000 acres 90 miles north of New York on the east side of the Hudson River for an estate, and then following a year later was given another 1,000 acres. So with a cumulative amount of land, 3,000 acres, he established an estate that became known as Coldingham. And that's present right near Poughkeepsie right now. Before he could be affirmed as the Surveyor General of New York, the governor stepped down, a new governor arrived, but fortunately for Colden, he was in the new governor's good grace and was immediately placed on the 12-man governor's council to give advice to the governor. There were two factions in New York at the time. One were the merchants in New York City, and the other were more of the country folk, and they were very, very polarized. And Colden was always the center of polarization for the remainder of his life. So his first job was as Surveyor General, and he traveled the areas mainly in the Mohawk Valley, the Catskill Mountains, and around Albany, and he gained the respect of the Indians, the Native Americans at the time. He drew the map that I showed you, which was published in New York in 1724. It was the first map ever published in the province of New York, and it is an important map in that it focuses on the Iroquois nation, the Five Nations, which then became Six Nations when the Tuscarora Indians joined them from Carolina. The map itself was of consequence, but at the same time, while surveying the land, he wrote a book, which you have in the collection here, published in 1727, The History of the Five Nations. Unfortunately, the book has nothing original in it and is actually a copy of material that had been written previously in the early 1700s by two French authors. But in the preface of the book, in the introduction, he makes a very impassioned plea for the Native Americans. And it's quite obvious that he was highly regarded by the Mohawks, at least, because they made him an honorary Mohawk member of their tribe. In 1724, he began to establish his farm on the Hudson, 3,000 acres. He originally thought it to be a vacation home, but as you'll see, it became his permanent home in short order when the governor was replaced by another governor, and the polarization of the politicians at the time was such that he was out of grace. Now, the farm was interesting because immediately he started to write a farm journal, and that is the oldest farm journal in the province of New York. The other unique aspect of the farm that he built was that it incorporated a canal, a freshwater canal going from a pond on the farm and emptying into the Hudson River. And there were horse-drawn carts that would take flat barges to the river. It was, in fact, the oldest canal in North America. And interestingly enough, in 1967, an archaeologic team has brought that canal back to its surface, and it can be visioned. And Colden had the concept for a canal to allow material to go from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, and that will play a role in the later part of our story, if you will. In 1728, Colden moves to this area, upstate New York. At that time, he has 8 children. All of the children are educated at home by him and his wife, quite successfully, as you'll note. And at that time, he's now 40 years old, he begins to correspond with people in England and in Europe, particularly about botany. And in addition, he carries out correspondence with other physicians, the other 10 in the colonies, and he organizes their thoughts to create the first learned society in America. Actually, that takes place in Boston as a medical society, and that eventually evolves, as you'll see, into the American Philosophical Society, which is attributed to Benjamin Franklin. So in the decade, we come to the more interesting part of his life, 1739 to 1748. He's in his 50s, and he emerges as the major American figure in the period of the Enlightenment. He became acquainted with the work of Linnaeus, the Swede who introduced taxonomy of flowers to the world. And in accordance with his typical, almost argumentative personality, he begins to correct Linnaeus and Linnaeus's concepts of taxonomy. But to his credit, and at Linnaeus's suggestion, he makes a catalog of all the flowers along the Hudson River, and Linnaeus himself publishes the work of Colden in a catalog. And then when Linnaeus's great book called Species Plantarum comes out in 1753, he refers to Colden as the individual who generated all the information regarding American flowers, and makes Colden's name personally ingrained, if you will, on the whole field of botany by naming a plant for him. So there is a plant known as Coldinia. In 1743, Colden and Franklin meet each other. They write each other very, very extensively about education, about waterworks, etc., and they become very, very close correspondents. And when the first convention of the American Philosophic takes place in 1743, Colden is one of the first 3 New York colonists to be made a member of the American Philosophic Association. Botany was a favorite subject with him, but that changes very rapidly. He becomes fascinated, devoted to Newtonian physics. Newton introduced his work in 1677, 57 rather. It was part of the curriculum that Colden studied when he was in Edinburgh. And then when Colden continues to study Newtonian physics, he feels that he can contribute significantly to the great Sir Isaac Newton. Newton talked about motion and mass and gravitation. He indicated how motion and mass impacted on one another, but Newton in his works says quite specifically, I do not know the cause of gravity and can't come to a conclusion about it. Colden, however, was convinced that he could answer Newton's question. And without carrying out any experiments at all, based purely on multiple hypotheses, he writes a book entitled An Explication of the First Causes of Matter and the Causes of Gravitation. This book, published in New York in 1745, is the first scientific work published in North America. It's a 48-page document, and it is a scientific treatise. Almost immediately, with the publication of this book, which is disseminated widely to Europe and England, the following comments come out. First, the author is mistaken in every part, close quote. And the major mathematician of the day, Euler, writes, the work is a complete absurdity. And there is a byproduct of this work, because Colden, not satisfied with defining Newtonian physics, writes a book on philosophy, which makes him accredited as being the first materialist philosopher in America. We come then to 1749 and back to a map, and I bring that forth because I've blown up that little square so you can see where Coldenham is in reference to New York City. Colden provided all of the material related to New York for this very, very important map. We're now coming to the French and Indian War. 1754, Colden is concerned about the safety of his family, so he rents a place in Long Island. And it's during that time that Colden reaches his political presence and also the reputation trough of his life. He becomes the most disliked man in all of the American colonies. In 1716, Colden becomes the lieutenant governor of New York. And this is the official who actually runs the province. The governor is usually absent, either in England or doing something else. And as lieutenant governor of New York, beginning in 1760, he becomes gradually but continually the most reviled man in the colony. The new governor is appointed, he leaves, and Colden takes over. And this is the comment from the New York Assembly regarding Cadwallader Colden. The old body was disliked enough, but now we prefer Beelzebub to himself. And Colden's reputation reached its absolute trough in 1765, related to the famous Stamp Act, enacted in England to pay off the French and Indian War. After he took an oath to uphold that act, he was burned in effigy near Wall Street, his carriages were destroyed, and his sedan chair in which he was carried was also destroyed. And he was referred to as the most reviled Tory in the colonies. Interestingly enough, this man remained an active participant in politics during his 9th decade. While he was an 80-year-old, he served 3 governors continually as a lieutenant governor, spending most of the time running the colony of New York, because during the interregnums, if you will, and during the absences which were frequent of the governor. At that time, he had this portrait drawn of him, and also at that time, he wrote the charter for the second oldest hospital in America. That's the New York Hospital, which is now Cornell Hospital, second only to the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia as far as age is concerned. So now we're coming to 1776. September 21st is a memorable day because it's the day that Nathan Hale is captured. Nathan Hale is captured about 3 miles from the house that Colden is living in. But Colden was not alive at the time. He dies the day before Nathan Hale is captured. And he leaves an extraordinary legacy. His youngest son gets his land at Flushing, Long Island. That's his grandson. This land here. Flushing, Long Island, his youngest son gets the house, but because his youngest son was loyal to the crown during the American Revolution, the land does not remain with him, and eventually, after going through several ownerships, is taken over by a cemetery, the Cedar Grove Cemetery, and Colden's old house becomes the business office of the cemetery. The fascinating thing, the extraordinary circumstance to me was 2 miles from where this house is and the cemetery is where my parents were buried in an adjacent cemetery. So after spending this time with me, there was an emotional tie. Now, I did come across, in doing research, a live descendants who had the original tract plan for the Colden estate. That's a blow-up of a section of the And after Colden dies, that part of Coldingham is taken over by his son, who was a major with the revolutionary troops, so he keeps the land, and he converts the wooden house in Coldingham to a very magnificent stone mansion. But time takes its toll, as you can see, and this is what it looks like today. There is a historical marker. It is a national historic possession, and there are 2 interesting placards there. One indicates this was the House of Stone of Colden. This is his son now, where it was located. And adjacent to that placard is another fascinating placard. It relates to Colden's daughter, Jane Colden, whom he trained to be an extraordinary botanist, whose work on botany is present in the British Museum, and who is responsible for naming the gardenia, and is the first female scientist in all of America, a daughter of Cadwallader Colden. His youngest son, the most notable, offspring is his grandson, who is the mayor of New York in 1818. In 1825, he is responsible for the ceremony for the opening of the famous Erie Canal. And when the Erie Canal opens in 1825, this is something I did not refer to. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can view this as a permanent exhibit. This is from the Colden Mansion, and it's in the furniture section. This comes forth at the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, and at the very top, under the angel's hand, is Cadwallader Colden. And to his right, in second place, is George Washington. So he does have some reputation. So I have actually lived with this specter of what I consider a quixotic, dislikable man for 4 decades. Let me offer a personal assessment, what I think of his life. As a paterfamilias, the head of a family, he deserves great praise. His family loved him. His kids admired him. His wife loved him for the entire marriage. As far as friendships and associations are concerned, I'll borrow the words of some other person. Quote, "He had no close friends, but a few personal ones, and no enemies, but quite a few public ones. He left no legacy in the realm of medicine. His one map, however, is of significance related to the Iroquois nation. The book for which his reputation was initially established has no value as an item of history. But he has been valuable in botany. He contributed for the first time the introduction of taxonomy, Linnaean taxonomy, to America, and he created the first female scientist and the first female botanist in the New World. And although he was among the first New Yorkers to be elected to the American Philosophic Society, he hardly merited the accolade of the most learnable man in the colonies. And as far as his favorite subject, Newtonian physics, he remains ludicrous. Now, what would Colden think if he was in the audience today? Would he be pleased with our assessment with him after he had died? He would be most disturbed when the very famous biography written by Benjamin Franklin came out, and that was started in 1771. Franklin, who had conducted a tremendous correspondence with Colden, never ever mentions his name in his autobiography. That would be offset, I hope, a little bit by a biography that finally has been written by him, at least putting his name on the jacket of a book. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. As I mentioned, hold your questions. There'll be time for that at the end. Our second speaker is Marc Leepson. And
thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I get 20 minutes to talk about Francis Scott Key's life, so I did have 2 cups of coffee, so I think I'll be able to cram in most of the stuff if I speak fast. So we all know the name Francis Scott Key, and basically we know one thing about the guy, right? What happened on the night of September 13th, 1814 in Baltimore Harbor. Turns out he was only 35 years old when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. He went on to be a big and important lawyer in Washington, D.C., and a player in the early Republic. He had this thriving legal practice, one of the best attorneys in Washington. He argued over 125 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. And he disdained politics for most of his life, but he became an ardent Jacksonian Democrat when Andrew Jackson got elected in 1828. He became a member of Jackson's kitchen cabinet, and he also was appointed U.S. Attorney for Washington for 8 years, from 1833 to 1841. By the way, he kept his private practice while he was U.S. Attorney for Washington, but they had different rules back then. So, he was a player in all of the major issues of the early republic. He died in 1843. So I'll give you a quick survey of his life. We'll concentrate mostly on this amazing thing that happened to him in Baltimore Harbor during the Battle of Baltimore, and we'll talk a little bit about his life after 1814. So he was born in 1779 outside of Frederick, Maryland. You all know where Frederick, Maryland is. It was a plantation called Terra Rubra, Red Earth, that his great-great-grandfather was. His great-great-grandfather came over here from England in 1720. He was a lawyer, a big lawyer. He settled in southern Maryland, had a big practice, and he made a lot of money. He bought a lot of land all over the colony of Maryland, including this place. Frank, oh, by the way, they called him Frank, okay? So from now on, you all know him as Frank Key. If there are any questions, I would like them to refer to as Frank. So Frank's great-grandfather was a lawyer. His grandfather, Francis Key, who he was named after, was a lawyer. His father was a lawyer, John Ross Key. His uncle, he had one uncle, Philip Barton Key I, who was also a big lawyer. Frank's father joined the Continental Army and fought in the Revolution. Frank's father's only brother, Philip Barton I, was a loyalist during the Revolution. And not only was he a loyalist, he fought for the British against us. He was taken prisoner after the war, and he decided to go to England. And he read law there, became a big lawyer in England, and he decided he was coming back home. So, and by the way, I talk about Philip Barton Key I because he was a big influence on Frank, and I'll explain it in a little bit. Bigger than his father. So Philip Barton came back, and loyalists were treated along an entire spectrum of being welcomed with open arms to being practically tarred and feathered. He was welcomed with open arms. He moved back to Annapolis. Again, a thriving law practice. He became mayor of Annapolis. He later moved to Washington, D.C., bought a huge tract of land in Washington, D.C. called Woodley Park. You all know where Woodley Park is, near American University? Yes, even back then it was like that. He built a mansion called Woodley that's still there on Cathedral Avenue in Washington, D.C. And he got completely rehabilitated, or maybe not, when he got elected to the U.S. Congress. He was a congressman from Maryland for 3 terms. So that's Philip Barton. So back to Frank. So Frank is educated at home until he's 9 years old, and the family sends him off to a new college for primary school and college in Annapolis called St. John's College. As you know, St. John's College is still there today. The classroom where actually he was Frankie back then, where Frankie studied is still there. And there's a desk, and you can look at it, and he carved his no, sorry, I made that part up. But you can walk into McDowell Hall at St. John's College in Annapolis, and you can see where Francis Scott Key and the others studied. He graduated in 1796. He stayed in Annapolis and read law, and he met a woman named Polly Lloyd, who was from the Lloyd family of Maryland. Her father, Edward Lloyd, was the richest man in Maryland. He owned Y Plantation. You know where Y Island is? W-Y-E, still there. He had a huge plantation. He owned hundreds of slaves. He had his own schooner that he went back and forth plying his trade to Baltimore. So he met Colonel Lloyd had died, and Polly and her mother and sisters were living in the Lloyd townhouse in Annapolis. When I say the words townhouse, you think what I think. Townhouse, right? A skinny house. So go to the Chase Lloyd house in Annapolis. It's about 3/4 of an entire block. It's a house museum now. The Chase family owned it, then the Lloyd family. It's right on College Avenue. It's right next to St. John's College. It's definitely worth seeing if you're interested in history. So tongues wagged when Frank married Polly Key, because he was this young lawyer from the sticks out near Frederick, Maryland, and she was Polly Lloyd. They did get married, probably in Chase Lloyd House, and then he took her out to the sticks. They moved to Frederick, and he plied his trade of the law for 3 years. They had 2 children, and then he had bigger horizons, so he moved to Washington, D.C. in 1805. They moved into a house on Bridge Street in Georgetown. Bridge Street is M Street now. You all know Georgetown. It's the main street And I can tell you where Francis Scott Key's house was, where they lived from 1805 to 1830. If you come over the Key Bridge, named after who? No, Frank Key. Right. It's actually the Frank Key Bridge. Sorry. So if you go over the Francis Frank Key, if you come over the Key Bridge, and you make a right turn onto M Street, and you're in the heart of Georgetown, right at the corner, there's a park. That's Francis Scott Key Park. That's not where the house was. If you come over the bridge and make a left turn towards Georgetown University, it's that corner. There's no house there. There's an entrance ramp to the Whitehurst Freeway. Now, to orient you so that I know you'll know, mostly Washingtonians know this, but you all are close enough. It's right across the street from Dixie Liquors. People are nodding their heads. Okay. And also the Exorcist steps, right? You know where the Exorcist, that hill that comes out? Okay. So that's where the house was. What happened was it went out of the family. It got owned by the National Park Service. And they tried to save it, but in 1947, when they built the Whitehurst Freeway, which goes along the Potomac, it was torn down. Now, they took the bricks and the boards of that house, and they put them across the street where that park is now, with the idea of rebuilding the house. Guess what happened? They disappeared. The bricks and the boards disappeared. So a citizens group, not one of our great stories of historic preservation, a citizens group formed and built Francis Scott Key Park only in 1992. There's a bust of Key there. There's historical interpretation. I looked at it. It's all right. So go there, believe it, and so on. So that's 1805, and they moved to Washington. He becomes this big lawyer in town. He's famous for his oratorical skills in persuading juries to do things. War of 1812. Let's move up to the War of 1812. So ironically enough, Francis Scott Key, you know him as Frank. Frank Key was adamantly against the U.S. going into the war. You know, sometimes we forget our historical memories with wars is particularly not good. But the country was extremely divided about the Revolution, before the War of 1812, and it was kind of like a North-South thing, right? The Southerners were all for war against the Brits. Thomas Jefferson famously. Everybody. Northerners were mostly against it. Now, Frank was a Southerner. You have to consider Frank a Southerner. He grew up in the slave-owning state of Maryland on a plantation. His family owned slaves. He owned slaves for his entire life. He had a Southern outlook. And yet, he was strongly against the U.S. going into war against the Brits. He called it a lump of wickedness. Now, Key changed his mind about that about a year after it started, in the spring of 1813, because things got a little too close for comfort. That British fleet started coming up the Chesapeake Bay and raiding those towns in Virginia. It wasn't good. In fact, Key joined a militia unit in Georgetown. He put on a uniform. He went out to the Chesapeake. He served for about a week, and then he decided he didn't like the Army, and he quit. Now, I was in the Army in 1966. Boy, I wish I could have quit. But anyway, so Frank quit the Army, came back. Fast forward to a year later, the spring of 1814. The war takes on a new complexion after the Brits defeat Napoleon. And they send over 5,000 crack troops, and they start doing some damage. They inflict upon us one of the worst defeats in U.S. military history. Not so much in terms of casualties. The Battle of Bladensburg, right? August 26, 1814. The militia units that we sent to face the Brits folded like a cheap suit in an hour. That's why there weren't that many casualties. You know, they called it the Bladensburg races because they raced away. And then why is it such an embarrassing defeat? What happened after? The Brits burned Washington. They burned the White House. Remember all this, the Treasury Department, the Library of Congress, etc. Now, interestingly enough, they did not burn any private buildings. They said they were burning public buildings because of what we did and when we went into York, Canada, and burned York, Canada, a.k.a. Toronto. So everybody fled. Not everybody, but most people fled. Frank sent Polly and the kids. By the way, they wound up having 11 children. He sent Polly and the kids up to Terra Rubra, and he tried to keep an eye on things because they did not know the Brits were not going to destroy private buildings. He showed up on the battlefield, actually, at Bladensburg, not to fight, but he knew the terrain. He thought he could help. Nothing helped. So after that ignominious defeat, the Brits took several prisoners. One of the prisoners was a medical doctor named William Beans. He was a prominent citizen of Upper Marlboro, Maryland. And Beans was a friend of Key. And so prisoner exchanges and prisoner releases were common during the War of 1812. And Dr. Beans was a medical doctor. He made the mistake of taking 2 straggler British troops prisoner in his barn. The Brits did not like that, and they hauled him away. He was in his early 60s. So Key was asked if he would mind to try to, facilitate this prisoner release. And here he was, the silver-tongued lawyer who convinced juries. He said yes. He got permission from President Madison. He got on his horse on September 2nd, and he rode up to Baltimore. When he got to Baltimore, he met with a man named Colonel John Skinner. John Skinner's job in the military was arranging prisoner releases and prisoner exchanges. They got on an American sloop. They went looking for the British fleet. They found them at the Patuxent River, and they were welcomed on board by the Brits. They sat down. They had a meal. They drank some wine, and that lawyer talked the Brits into letting Dr. Beans go. One thing he did before he left, he got a letter from the highest-ranking British prisoner officer in Washington, who said that these Americans are treating us fine. They're treating our wounded, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we think convinced them. Anyway, the Brits said, "Okay, Beans, you can go. Beans, Skinner, and Key, you can't leave the harbor until we bomb Baltimore to smithereens." They were after Baltimore, not like Washington. Why were they after Baltimore? Well, remember I talked about how the nation was divided, against. The Baltimore people were adamantly for going to war. They just couldn't wait to get into it. And in fact, we didn't have much of a navy when that war started, so the call went out for private ship owners to join the cause. And they did, by the scores. They were called privateers. So guess what city led the nation in privateers that wreaked hell on the British ships? The Baltimore Clippers, they were called. So the British were out to get Baltimore. The British press called Baltimore a nest of thieves. So they had an armada of ships. On the night of February 12th, they started a 25-hour bombardment. 1,500 rockets and mortars. Rockets! Mortars and bombs. Rockets! This is only the second time in the history of warfare that rockets were used. They were called Congreve rockets. They looked like what we think rockets look like, tall and skinny with fins. One problem, they had no aiming mechanism. So they would just go. Those rockets were bursting in air, you might say. No, the rockets whatever. So the rockets are flying. They had 5 bomb ships. You know what bomb ships are? All they did, they each had 4 giant cannons that threw out 250-pound cannonballs. Luckily, they couldn't aim very well. So we had this 25-hour bombardment. It might have been the longest sustained bombardment in military history. 1,500 rockets and bombs and mortars. Luckily for our team, they couldn't aim the rockets. The big bombs weren't very well aimed, and the commanding officer at Fort McHenry sunk American ships purposely in the harbor, so the Brits could not get close enough. Only 4 people were killed at Fort McHenry. And in fact, in Baltimore, no one was killed, but the citizens were terrorized because you can read the letters. The houses were shaking to their foundation. Well, by the way, also there was a thunderstorm, a huge storm that night. Can you imagine what it was like? The rockets, the bombs, the thunderstorm, some people have described it as a hurricane or a tornado, and then last year somebody called it a derecho, which I thought was, great. So they had a derecho that night. Frank, Skinner, and Beans were taken off the ship, put back on their American ship, and that's where they watched the Battle of Baltimore. There's also a land component of the Battle of Baltimore. Don't have time to talk about it. But and by the way, the Baltimore was ready for the Brits, unlike Washington. They had good military leadership there. A man named General Smith. They could see the flames of Washington burning after Bladensburg from the high points of the city of Baltimore. So they were ready. They had 15,000 trained militia troops. Fort McHenry was bristling with guns. They prevailed on land, and we prevailed. Fort McHenry stood. Now, so Key, Skinner, and Beans are on the American ship. Sometimes you hear they were held prisoner. They were under guard. They weren't like under decks with bread and water, but they couldn't leave. So they're watching the battle. At 3 o'clock in the morning, stops. But they don't know. They don't know who won. They just know it's over. You know, if they had Twitter back then, we wouldn't have the Star Spangled Banner. Frank, war ends. Brits leaving. We win. Okay, let's go home. So, you know, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. They're pacing the deck. Finally, let me see, dawn's early light. Okay, the dawn's early light. Frank looks, and he sees a flag there. And he realizes that we won. He's an amateur poet. He has a letter in his pocket. Sometimes you hear an envelope. No, that was President Lincoln. They didn't have envelopes back then, right? Back of the letter, he writes, starts a verse. They let him go. He comes back to a hotel in Baltimore and writes 3 more verses. Doesn't have a title to it. Now, what happened next is, part of it is mysterious. Here's why. Francis Scott Key only spoke about what happened that night in public once in his entire life, in 1834, 20 years later. As far as letters are concerned, all of us who have looked into it have only found one letter. He wrote it October 4th, and he didn't even mention writing anything. He talked about Dr. Beans, he talked about the Brits. So what we have to go on is a 5,000-word account that was written by Francis Scott Key's brother-in-law. Who was Francis Scott Key's? 5 minutes, oh my God. Who was Francis Scott Key's brother-in-law? Roger Brooke Tawney, right? Future Chief Justice of the United States. He married Key's only sister. They were very close friends. And Tawney wrote this account in the 1850s. So, you know, we're all interested in history here. We know that something written 40 years later, he said it was what Frank had told him about what happened that night. But we can corroborate certain things with newspaper accounts, with letters of the time. So what we think happened is somebody, we don't know who, took this manuscript to a printer, because we do know 2 days later it came out on broadsheets with the title Defense of Fort McHenry. And it said to be sung to the tune of To Anacreon in Heaven. What's To Anacreon in Heaven? Very popular song of the day, the theme song of the Anacreontic Society, a British men's club who would, discuss literature, and they did it in taverns, so there was eating and drinking. Sometimes you hear it called a British drinking song. You know, it's not like a 99 bottles of beer on the wall drinking song. It's a little more high-minded. And back then, it was common for words to be morphed onto existing melodies, and To Anacreon in Heaven was the most popular melody. So 2 months later, it comes out on sheet music. The title is changed, Star Spangled Banner. And it becomes a well-known patriotic song in the early republic. Not anything close to, we didn't have an official national anthem, but it's just one of them. And by the turn of the 20th century, it's de facto, and it doesn't become official national anthem until 1931, when President Hoover signed executive order. Not even an executive order. I got executive orders on my head for some reason. A resolution passed by Congress. And I always just like saying the words President Hoover anyway. So, all right, so now I'm going to sum up the rest of his life in how many minutes? 3.5? Thank you very much. All right, 2 things you should know about Frank, aside from this. He was very patriotic, of course, and he was very pious. Piety and patriotism run through his whole life. He was an Episcopalian. He very seriously thought about going into the Episcopal priesthood. He declined because he had this big family. He wrote a letter to the Bishop of Maryland saying, I can't do this, I have to feed my family. But he was very active in his church, St. John's Church in Georgetown, which is still there on O Street. If you walk by, you can see the plaque. He was a lay minister. He taught Sunday school, et cetera, and all of his letters are suffused with quotes from the Bible and admonitions to his children or who he was ever writing to stay that way. And the second thing we should know is that he was the issue of slavery, number one issue in the early republic. Frank, a strong voice in what happened in the early republic. He had played a role in the national debate over slavery. He was a slave owner from a slave-owning family, but he was a very religious man. He was strongly against slave trafficking. Remember, international slave trafficking was illegal in the United States since 1808. Slavery was legal in most states. He did own slaves his entire life. But he spoke out against this evil of slave trafficking. And anyway, his idea, and the idea of many others, to end slave trafficking was colonization. So in 1816, he was a founding member of the American Colonization Society, which formed in Washington, D.C. And he was on the board of managers till the day he died. He was a strong proponent of colonization. What was colonization? It was to take free blacks, not slaves, free blacks only, and send them to a new colony on the west coast of Africa that would become the colony and the nation of Liberia. So it was very controversial. Abolitionists hated the idea. Frank and abolitionists were completely at odds. It's something you should know about him, and I go into it in detail in my book, this book. And so I'll have to end it with that, but let me just say one other thing really quickly. I told you that Frank was an amateur poet. Guess what? He was a bad amateur poet, okay? Don't take my word for it. He never meant for the poetry that he wrote to go beyond family and friends. He was always scribbling things for birthdays and holidays and funerals and so on. So, but in the 1850s, someone published a volume of his poetry, which you can read on Google Books. So just Google Francis Scott Key, bad poetry, or just poetry. And you can, so just don't take my word for it. You can read his poems. They're just not good, which makes what he wrote that night so much more impressive. You know the words. I know the words. Hundreds of millions of others know those words. So he was just not a good poet. And secondly, there was an interview with one of his granddaughters that I found in a newspaper in the 1870s. It's the last thing I'm going to say, and except for something after that. And so they talked about the song, and she said, Granddaddy was unmusical. Unmusical. Yeah, he once went to an event in Alabama where they played the song, and supposedly he turned to someone next to him and said, "That's a beautiful air. What is it?" Probably an apocryphal story, but it does point to the fact that Frank was unmusical. Now, me, when I hear unmusical, I think tone deaf. Okay? So here we go. Here's the irony. Last thing I'm going to say. Our national anthem was written by a man who was a bad poet and was tone deaf. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being a good sport about the signs. We'll take questions from the audience now, and I'll try to spread it around as much as I can. Yes.
I'm wondering about Frank Key. Did he have any role in the relocation of the Cherokee Indians in what we now know as Trail of Tears?
The Cree. He did have a role in the. It was a controversy over the Creek Indian lands in Georgia and Alabama under Jackson. It was an incipient rebellion by the state of Alabama. Things were getting bad. What happened was they were arguing over who had, they kicked the creek out, and they were going to apportion the land. Well, white settlers came in and just took over. And there were federal troops there, and somebody got into it, and they shot and killed one guy. Well, Alabama, this was 1833, it was dicey. And Jackson, who was, Mr. States' Rights, became Mr. Union, hold the Union together. He did not want this. So he sent his legal advisor, Francis Scott Key, down to Alabama. That's where they played that air, and he said, what is it? And he met with the governor, he met with the state legislators, and they crafted a compromise. Now, meanwhile, back in Washington, Jackson was working with the Alabama congressional delegation. So between them and between Frank in Alabama, they came up with sort of a compromise, which, of course, you won't be surprised to learn, basically let the settlers keep the land after a while. So that was his involvement in that.
The prejudice is so strong among Indians, and I'm part Indian, that you will not find an Indian named Andrew.
Well, the Indian Expulsion Act of 1832,
yeah.
Right, absolutely.
Other questions in the back there?
Dr. Schwartz? Nice talk, thank you. My question was Colden lieutenant governor during the negotiations over the Albany plan of Ben Franklin and Tom Hutchinson, lieutenant governor of Massachusetts?
Yes, and that was a nuclear event in his life. The governor, this was on the eve of the French and Indian War. It was an important event in several effects. It was the time that Franklin's sign, "Join or Die," the cartoon, appeared in the newspaper. But at the event, the governor of New York, with whom Colden attended the meeting, got ill. So Colden spoke for the governor and indicated that he was the second most important person in the colony of New York. He came back to New York City, where the council met and the assembly met, and they thought that he had usurped his powers. And actually, the assembly attempted to have Colden's appointments suspended, and London refused to do that. So yes, he was there and actually made all the expressions related to the colony of New York at that meeting.
Other question? Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Didn't the colony of New York support the Albany Plan of Defense?
That's a very interesting point. They did not support it. They did not disagree with the plan. Actually, they were the one group of the colonies that didn't come forth as a statement of support. But they never indicated they would disagree.
Other questions out there? I have one for Dr. Schwartz. I'll come back to you. I'm going to take a little privilege here, a short one. You pointed to, Dr. Schwartz, the 1749 map by Lewis Evans and the sourcing from Cadwallader Colden. Are you aware of any direct correspondence between those two? Did they ever communicate, or Evans just knew of his work and used it?
No, they did communicate. It's not included in the 4,000 words of the New York Historical. There is a manuscript in New York, at the New York Historical, between Colden and Evans. Evans asked him to provide the material.
Okay, thank you. Sir, you want to...
Maybe I missed it, but when was the first printing of the Star Spangled Banner? I thought it was in Niles' Register.
No. Well, I mean, as far as newspapers were concerned, no. The first printing was a broadsheet 2 days later that was spread all over Baltimore. And then it came in newspapers all over the country within days. Yeah.
Whoever gets the microphone first, go ahead.
Hey, Mark. Biographers are a special breed of writer. What was the catalyst? What was that moment when you said, I got to write this biography? What light bulb was it? What happened?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so I had finished my previous book, which was a concise biography of the Marquis de Lafayette. It came out in 11, so I finished it in 10 sometime. And I was looking around for my next book, and I was looking at 2014, and I was sort of thinking about World War I. I mean, 1914 was one of the most amazing years in the history of the world, and I started looking around, and it just seemed to me as though it had just been done to death. So then I was thinking about 1814, and I had written this book called Flag, an American Biography. It's a history of the American flag. It came out in 05, and when I did the research for that book in 03 and 04, and when I came time to look up to find out about Francis Scott Key, there wasn't a biography. The most current biography was 1937. So I thought, this can't be the case. And of course, what did I do? I went on Amazon, etc., and there hadn't been a biography. So I called my agent, and I said, now I have to tell you that my agent specializes in telling me that my ideas for books are the worst he's heard in 35 years in publishing. So I said, Joe, there hasn't been a bio of Key since 1937. And he didn't believe me, of course. But then, anyway, when he found out, he said, oh, yeah, go for it. So we did, and that's the story of that. Thank you.
Thanks.
There was another question. Yeah, right there.
Dr. Schwartz, Colden took less than a year to go back to his hometown and get a wife and come back. Was he romantic also, or did he know he was going back for?
He was the son of a Scotch Presbyterian minister. And when you read the letters from his father to his son, each letter is not a parental letter, but a sermon. And his wife was the daughter of a Scotch Presbyterian minister. They were very, very rigid personalities, and it becomes manifest. Colden was the most uncompromising man I've ever read about, actually. Extraordinary.
I'm looking. I see one over on the far side there.
I wasn't sure if you were going to cut us off.
I'll try not to.
I could surmise why you don't like him, but you started out your talk saying you grew to dislike this man very much. what about him in particular drove you to that conclusion, I guess?
Well, he's interesting. He's a polymath. He did some very good things. I like his attempts to be intellectual, and he was unusual in that regard. He did some reasonable things. As a physician, he brought together the first public health laws in all of the colony, to his credit. But when you read his dialogues with his fellow politicians, they're all very supercilious. You sense that he is looking down on everybody else, and probably to some extent rightfully so, because he's the most educated person in the colony of New York, with an Edinburgh degree, a Doctor of Medicine's degree from London, etc., very widely read, and the other people are just merchants who are very successful and very wealthy. So he disdains them, and they return the disdain to him, I felt, quite appropriately.
I think we have time for one more here. Does somebody have something? If not, we'll tell you to please, as many of you as can, please buy a book, and the authors will remain up here to sign those books for you. Again, thank you very much for coming, and please return those yellow evaluation forms to the volunteers. Thank you very much. Hope you have time to get to your next event.